Interviewing was easy. Getting guests, no problem. I think the just technical part of launching and all the little things you have to do, I was a little blown away by the details of it. The editing audio, that was a little challenging for me. And then also letting go. Like, you were really good at coaching me to just like put it out there, even if it wasn't perfect. And for so many years, I'd been such a perfectionist. And that was part of why I started a podcast. I'm like, hey, if I have to put out a show every single week, I have to let go of being perfect because it's not going to be perfect. And I have to be okay to fail. Like, some shows are going to suck, and that's okay.
Podcast Junkies, episode 252. Welcome back. I'm your host, Harry Duran. If you are new to the podcast, it's the one where we talk to interesting voices in podcasting and learn about what makes them kick, the inspiration for starting the shows, and wherever the conversation leads us. Last week was a meandering and really interesting conversation with Dustin Miller, host of the Polymath Polycast. Dustin is a fascinating individual, and we took a couple of different rabbit holes on that podcast. I'd be interested to see and hear what your feedback was from that episode. This week, I have a friend of the show, Shelby Stanger. She's a journalist, an adventurer, and a podcast creator, and she joins us this week to talk about her background in journalism, her passion for surfing, and how she initially got involved in podcasting. This episode is brought to you by Focusrite, and specifically the Scarlett 2i2 sound card, one of my favorite go-to sound cards, something I use for each and every podcast recording. The 3G line is a go-to for all new podcasters. Find out more at podcastjunkies.com/Focusrite, and the link will be in the show notes as well. Shelby and I worked together on the launch of her award-winning show, Wild Ideas Worth Living, which was eventually sold to REI, and she remains as a host as of January of this year. Currently, she's advising major brands and individuals on how to start and grow and monetize their own podcasts, and has a brand new show, Vitamin Joy, where she discusses the topics of health and humor and good living. Full show notes available at podcastjunkies.com/252. If you enjoyed this episode or past episodes, I'd love it if you leave a rating and a review at ratethispodcast.com/podcastjunkies. This episode is also brought to you by Fullcast. If you're looking for help as a business with your podcast, we offer done-for-you services, coaching and consulting with our done-with-you services. And now we also have the Ultimate Podcast Dojo available. It's a new course and community designed to help you start your own podcast. Additional details at fullcast.co/dojo, D-O-J-O. Make sure you stay to the end of the episode where I reveal this week's retention hashtag. If you don't know what that is, it's a hashtag you can share on Twitter, but I'll only share it to people who listen to the entire episode. So check that out. Let's get surfing with Shelby. Shelby Stanger, long time overdue. Thank you for joining us on Podcast Junkies.
Harry, I'm so honored to be on your podcast because you're the one who got me into podcasting. You helped launch this whole career.
It got you down this path, and little did I know what was going to get started when we started working together.
Well, I'm really grateful for all of your advice and input, and podcasting has brought me so much joy. It's brought me a job, and I've met just so many incredible people. Like, not only my guests, but listeners. It's been so amazing. Thank you.
I think my first question, and sometimes because this is audio only, the listener doesn't get to see what I'm seeing, but I count 9 surfboards behind you.
It's like 9 or 10. Yeah, I don't know. We don't have art, and you know, our surfboards are in basically our dining room, sort of like college dorm style. But we live in a condo that's on the beach. Literally, we have cliffs that stairs that go down to the beach. It's falling apart. It was like built in the '60s, but hey,
is it the same one that
you came over? Yeah, we haven't left.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome.
So we have a lot of surfboards. We don't have a lot of other things, but we have a lot of surfboards.
Did you surf today?
I didn't because it rained, and you're not supposed to surf after it rains.
Okay.
But we surfed pretty much every day, twice a day.
Wow.
For the last 3 weeks, and my arms can't move, so I was very grateful for the rain. California's had the best run of surf we've probably ever had. You know, everybody says El Nino years are the best.
Yeah.
But turns out La Nina produces not only good surf, but less rain and wind. So, except for the last couple of days, but we got really just ideal. It was like all of us have been through hell and we're in like massive quarantine in California, but this has been a gift from nature. Good waves.
What's the time frame or what's the frequency of La Nina?
I have no idea. That's a good question. I don't know.
Well,
like a year? A year maybe? I don't know. We're supposed to get like a year of good waves and it brings colder water, but we've had really great waves. And I could be making this up. I'm not a meteorologist, but that's what I'm reading.
Well, everyone becomes a virologist after the pandemic.
That's
right?
true.
Well, I heard that you can get infected by like sneezing in wind or something. Like, it's just like we all think like we're scientists now. So.
We're in wild times. I'm actually not going to claim scientist or mathematician, but I will claim podcaster now.
Yeah. One last question about surfing. Do you remember how old you were and where you were when you first surfed?
Yeah, I was 9 years old in Waikiki, Hawaii.
Oh.
And a guy on a big longboard pushed me into my first wave, and I have a picture of it. And I'm like standing up like Gidget, like feet first. You're supposed to stand sideways, but I was standing feet first because the guy next to me was on basically a precursor to a stand-up paddleboard. He was standing on a big surfboard with a paddle and a Kodak camera to take pictures.
Yeah.
And he was standing forward. So I was watching him, and so I stood forward, and just the biggest grin ever. And I have a picture of it. Waikiki is a great place to learn to surf. My grandma lived there when I was a little kid.
Yeah.
She was, 80 years old. Bikini, lying out by the beach, Mai Tai in one hand, cigarette in the other, a man 20 years younger by her side. She was pretty wild, awesome grandma. And she got me surf lessons.
Seems like you inherited something else from her as well.
She was pretty awesome.
Yeah, my girlfriend lived in Hawaii for 6 years. She went to college there. So.
Good for her. University of Hawaii?
Yeah. So
Good for her.
That's one of the options, as depending how crazy things get this year and next year. So
do it. Move to Hawaii.
When you got on that board, did you immediately know like this was for you, or did it take a while? Or
I wanted to be a surfer ever since I was a little kid, but girls didn't really surf. Like I lived in a town called Cardiff by the Sea. My dad was from Brooklyn, New York. He was a dentist. My mom was a professor and from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So they kind of didn't get it, but they took me to the beach and I went boogie boarding, and I was a soccer player. So I was a really good athlete. Just naturally, I had a lot of energy. And so they put me into sports, and soccer was what women did, young girls. So I was a soccer player. And my dad passed away suddenly of a heart attack when I was 11. And he had just agreed to take me to the beach every Sunday so I could boogie board. But I wanted a surfboard. And so that summer, my sister got me a surfboard for my birthday, and I started surfing. And I went to a surf camp, and I learned to surf at the surf camp. And it was
Where was that at?
It was in San Diego. It was called Mission Bay Aquatic Center. And every morning you could either take surfing, water skiing, sailing, or kayaking. And then in the afternoon, you did all those sports. And I had really good looking guy instructors. And then one week I had this woman who was an instructor. And she was good looking and funny, and all the guys liked her. And she happened to teach Princeton Review SAT classes. She spoke fluent French and Spanish. So my mom loved her. So she became my babysitter. Years later, my mom remarried this great guy, moved to a house with a studio off the back in San Diego, and that woman moved in with us. Oh. She's now my best friend, and she started Surf Diva, which is the first original all-girls surf school in the world. And she was my first surf instructor. I mean, besides the guy in Hawaii.
What's interesting, I don't know, in terms of the timing there, because this is, I mean, now you obviously see strong women, powerful women, like you see them more and more. But at that time, it must have been inspiring for you to have a role model like that, to see someone like that. Yeah,
it was awesome. Like I think, there's this big movement of representation and how it matters. And like, I think I didn't even understand it. But if I think about surfing, like there was no one, when you see someone who looks like you, who does it, you feel like you can do it. Even this last couple of weeks, the surf was really big. And there's a lot of women who surf in San Diego. When the surf gets bigger, you see less of them. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not charging. There's girls who charge way harder than me at a lot of surf breaks. But at the particular break in front of my house, I didn't see a lot of women. And I was just terrified. And then one day I saw another girl, and I was like, okay, I can do this. It's wild how it works like that. But it's nice to see people who look like you do the things you want to do. Yeah. What's the biggest wave you've ever surfed? Oh, maybe just like a little bit over, maybe double overhead. I do not like big waves. I'm actually trying to find a hypnotist coach who can teach me how to surf big waves, or at least not be afraid of big waves. I don't know why I have fear. I think, a lot of fear is just the unknown, right? And if you don't have a lot of practice doing something, it's daunting. at the same time, I've never seen women surf waves as big as they are surfing right now in this moment in history. It's incredible to see. I just don't have that. I'm 40 now, so I also like don't have that same desire like I did when I was 29.
Yeah.
And a frother.
What's the most exotic or most beautiful place you've ever surfed?
When I was 29, I was working at Vans, running international sales and marketing. Great job. And I just wanted to be a writer. I wanted to quit. It made no sense on paper. Long story short, I started putting the balls in motion and I started reaching out to different magazines, pitching stories, also telling PR people, hey, I'm thinking about quitting my job. If you ever need stories written, like I'm your girl. And the day, it's a long story, but the day, I fought depression, all sorts of things. Quitting made no sense on paper. I had a great job. And being a writer at the height of the recession wasn't an ideal decision money-wise.
Yeah.
But I knew I had been a writer as a kid and went to journalism school, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so the day I decided to quit my job, I got invited to surf this place called the Mentawais, which is an archipelago of islands off of Indonesia.
Wow.
And I was going to cover a group of 10 guys surfing or stand-up paddling these undersurfed, really big waves in the middle of the ocean. And I thought I was just going to go and be the journalist and cover them because I'd been working in an office for a couple of years. I hadn't been surfing. But, by day 3 of sitting on a boat, you eventually want to jump in and not get seasick. And so I surfed the most exotic, beautiful waves ever. And I was the only girl on the boat. There's 10 guys. They're all a bit older than me, minus the boat captain and one of the guys on the trip. So it was a wild adventure of a lifetime. And I'd interview, and I ended up getting what they call, a glimpse of my first barrel, meaning the wave kind of broke and sort of went over my head for like a nanosecond.
Yeah.
Some would claim it wasn't a full barrel, but whatever, I'm claiming it.
Let's call it a full barrel here.
Yeah.
That's fine.
It wasn't like a full barrel, but it was like a cover up, right?
Yeah.
You just see this pool of crystal water over your head, and it's, I'd interview this guy later who's a big wave surfer, and he was older. He was about 80, and he said, surfing literally can change you. He said, I remember surfing a wave in Indonesia, and I came out of the barrel 20 years younger, and he literally felt his cells change.
Oh.
And I believe it. After that wave, I just had all this confidence. I just quit my job. I had a lot to prove. I wanted to be an adventure writer for magazines like Outside and ESPN.
Yeah.
And I did as a freelancer, but I had a lot to prove. And in that wave, that one wave, going inside like a tiny little cover up really changed me. It's amazing. Surfing can do that for you.
Yeah, I'm just getting chills the way you're describing it. Like at that moment, it feels like probably everything like slows down as well, right?
Everything slows down and all you see is like crystal water around you, and you're inside basically a waterfall. It'd be like it feels like to go inside of a waterfall. And there's this scientist named Vincent Wu who I've been trying to find and cannot find him, but he proves that when water hits each other, it creates negative ions, which I don't really understand this, but it creates it's good for you.
Yeah.
It's kind of like why people walk barefoot on the sand. There's
grounding. Yeah, definitely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I have this theory in my head, it's not based on science once again, that, getting barreled is like one of the best things you can do because there's all this negative ionic charge around you.
Yeah, or just being in the ocean, just grounding with nature, I think is so important. I think people lose sight of that, especially people that live in the city and forget what that's like and the importance of doing that on a daily basis.
Yeah, it's true.
Where did the writing bug come from?
I think that, it also happened after I'd always been a writer. Just as a little kid, everybody told me, hey, you're good at writing. You should be a journalist. But I think after my dad died, there was 2 things that helped me really process it. He died suddenly of a heart attack when I was 11. And I think in writing, I started journaling, and that helped me identify my thoughts and make some sort of sense out of what I couldn't. And I think the ocean also helped me because in the ocean, I found answers that I could never find with a pen and paper.
Wow.
And you had to be in nature. You had to sit still. Those were things that I wasn't very good at sitting still. I'm still not the best at it. But, there's something really powerful about being in nature with animals like dolphins and it's unexpected, right? You have no control in the water. Waves come. And I think the grieving process, so when I lost my dad, the grieving process, I feel like comes in waves. It comes and goes. You're angry one minute, you're sad the next, you're happy and remembering what a great human or your parent was. I was young, but I was pretty mature as an 11-year-old. I would say like my maturity slowed after that. But, I don't know. I think, writing, I had the bug really early. And then when I was 15, I remember I was in high school, I went to public high school, and the teacher said, hey, there's an essay contest for the San Diego Union Tribune. If you guys enter it, I'll give you extra credit. If you win, you'll get an automatic A. And I was like, I'm entering. And I won. And I got, my teacher got a $100 gift card to Nordstrom's. I got a $100 check, which is funny because you don't really get paid that much in journalism still today. I'm like, that's about pretty much what I still get when I write an article for a magazine. You get a little more than that. But it just gave me the confidence to be a writer. And then the next year, my sister was living in Washington, D.C., and she was doing an internship there. And she met these women who started a magazine for, by, and about youth. And they needed a youth reporter on the West Coast. So I got the job, and I wrote about, my mom was a professor at San Diego State, and I interviewed one of her students who was date raped. And then I wrote about a family member's personal battle with alcoholism and what it was like growing up in an alcoholic family. And kids wrote in and they were like, your story really affected me. One of my soccer teammates came up to me and said, hey, my boyfriend read your article and he's going to go get help for alcoholism. And I was 16 years old. So I was like, hey, stories are powerful. They can be cathartic. They can make a difference in someone's life. You have no idea who's listening to your story. So with podcasting, you have no idea who is listening and who might be affected by something you say. With writing, that's how I felt, and then when I found podcasting, I'm like, oh, this is so much easier than writing. You don't have to write. You can just talk.
Yeah. Where were you listening to them at the time, or how did you hear about them? Where'd that start?
Well, there was no podcasting when I was 16. So I followed the writing career pretty hardcore. Yeah. I went to journalism school. I had a adventure surfing column in my local newspapers when I was in college. I worked at CNN as an intern. I worked for a newspaper in South Africa. Like I was hardcore journalism. I'm going to be like Barbara Walters, but on paper.
Did you travel to South Africa?
I did. I went and spent a summer there when I was 19. Nice. Really not much longer after apartheid had ended. It was a pretty wild time. It was 99.
Yeah.
And I wrote about surfing and sports because I knew I would have to cover racism and AIDS and crime and everything else. And I just needed to do it through a lens I understood the world, which was sports. So it was a pretty incredible experience. So podcasting, I didn't start listening to podcasts until way after I quit my job, maybe 2014, 15, 16. Yeah. And I really liked Tim Ferriss's show. I thought it was great. But I was like, I wish he interviewed more girls. And I wish he'd talk about adventure because tech is great, but I'm not that interested in tech. Like a little bit, but it doesn't really get me out of bed. Stories about surfers and adventurers do. And all these people were like, you should start a podcast. You have all this marketing experience. You have journalism experience. And I took a strength finder test. I was kind of in between jobs. So I'd been a freelance journalist. So I'd worked at Vans until 2009 in different capacities in marketing and sales. In 2009, I quit my job to be a freelance journalist, lived in New Zealand, lived in Costa Rica, taught surfing at Surf Diva in Costa Rica, met my husband. We moved to New Zealand, and on the side, I was a business reporter for action sports industry. So I wrote about the businesses and the CEOs behind a lot of these brands like Patagonia, The North Face, Quicksilver, you name it. Yeah. And I was freelancing for Outside, ESPN. I took a couple in-house marketing jobs. I just was like, okay, I'm sick of writing. So I did this one story about Wim Hof, the guy who is the breath guru. And it was early on. It was like before people knew him. And a magazine, an outdoor magazine, whose name I'm not going to name, but you can guess, edited it to make him sound kind of like a charlatan. And I'm like, this guy was so awesome.
Oh, wow.
And whatever. I mean, they just made a big deal out of him getting money for what he does. And that's not how I wrote the story. So I was kind of bummed. And I was like, in a podcast, the whole interview would exist in its full form.
Yes.
And people would always ask me like, hey, what was it like interviewing so-and-so? And I just wanted to give them my transcript, right? Because our conversation was so rich. And that's what a podcast is. It's just the interview, which was my favorite part of journalism and the part I think I excelled at the best. So around 2015, 16, I started really, this idea of the podcast started brewing in the back of my mind. And no one was really doing it in action and outdoor sports. At least no one was doing it in action sports. And no one had a podcast about the outdoors and action sports that catered to men and women. And I thought I'd have a podcast that only women would listen to, But it turns out when I started Wild Ideas Worth Living, just as many men listened as women. In fact, more men listened than women, which was really cool. And I never played the girl card. So yeah, to answer your question, it was around 2016. I had this idea. And when I had the idea to start a podcast, I was like, listen, I have marketing experience. I have journalism experience. What I don't have is editing experience. And I also don't have a lot of, while I've interviewed the CEOs of every major company and done a ton of business stories, I've never started a business myself. Yeah. So a friend of mine while I was surfing was like, hey, you should take this entrepreneurship course. It's run by the woman who runs entrepreneurship at UCSD. And I was like, she's like, I think there's a session that starts now, today. So I literally got out of the water, called Sylvia. She answered her cell phone in class. And she said, we're starting our first session today. Shelby, you sound lovely. Come in. I'm like, I'm soaking wet from surfing. She's like, well, do you have a change of clothes? I was like, yeah. I mean, I have clothes, but I have salty hair. And she's like, it's okay. No worries. And I did this 12-week accelerator program.
Yeah.
And it was incredible. And it really helped me launch my podcast, but launch it as a business to start. So having that business mindset from the get-go was very helpful because I knew I needed editing help and I had to pay someone like Harry to edit my podcast. And to do that, I needed money to pay him. It's not like I'd saved, that much. Yeah. I didn't save that much money from my journalism job. I'd saved a lot from my Vans job, my marketing job. But yeah, I'd figure it out. It was great.
Is that inherent in you? Like, I sense this nature of just like, when you feel like you want to do something, you don't overthink it. You just like, well, this seems like the right next step for me, so I'm just going to do it.
Well, I'd like to say that. I'd say my inherent nature is to like overthink things, like go into like a deep depression because I haven't decided, ask a million people their opinion. And then eventually when the pain is too great to not do it, I get the courage and just go do it. I think I've like pivoted more towards what you're saying now. Like when I get, I'm more methodical now about how I make my decisions. I say no more. I say yes to things that really matter and no to kind of everything else right now. But yeah, at the time, it just felt right. Like I didn't totally know what else I was going to do. The journalism thing was just, it wasn't fulfilling me the way it had. But podcasting just, wow, it was mind blowing. Like I felt like I was friends with Tim Ferriss listening to his podcast. And I think people think they're friends with you when they listen to your podcast. And I like having more friends. Like I'm all for it.
So obviously we were helping you, we got the show launched for you, Wild Ideas Worth Living. What were some of the things that came easy for you in the beginning when you started the show? And what were some of the things that were challenging or you were surprised that you had to learn?
Interviewing was easy. Getting guests, no problem. I think the just technical part of launching and all the little things you have to do, I was a little blown away by the details of it. The editing audio, that was a little challenging for me. And then also letting go. Like you were really good at coaching me to just like put it out there, even if it wasn't perfect. And for so many years, I'd been such a perfectionist. And that was part of why I started a podcast. I'm like, hey, if I have to put out a show every single week, I have to let go of being perfect because it's not going to be perfect. And I have to be okay to fail. Like some shows are going to suck and that's okay. Because some people might like the shows that I think sucked. I get that all the time. People will be like, oh my God, I love this show. I'm like, I hated that show. But
it's funny because what you think is sometimes a good show for a certain reason, parts of it will resonate with a listener that, just picked out something in that person's life story or the way you were interviewing them. And it just, like, as you know, can relate to it, it hit them at the right place at the right time. And it's the message they needed to hear.
And you said something really magical to me in the beginning. You said, Shelby, there's this magic rule of 7. I think it's 9 now. But if you get to 7 shows, you're good to go.
Pod fading, yeah.
Pod fading. And those first 3 shows were really hard. And because I had taken that business accelerator course, on the last day of class, you have to present your product, whatever that is, to a team of investors. Like literally investors came in from San Diego to our class, which was incredible. And I crushed it. Because I had 3. So for my product, I needed 3 podcasts already produced. And having a deadline like that really forced me to actually get the podcast off the ground because, there was some serious skin in the game. Like there were actual people coming to see me and listen to my product. I had to have it ready. that was helpful. It was really hard to launch those first 3 shows, though. I didn't know how much but hiring a production company like Full Cast that did the music for me and everything else, that was pivotal. I couldn't have done that on my own.
Yeah, I think what's important as entrepreneurs is one of the things my coach says is when you're ready to grow, our impulse is to say, how do I do that? But the proper question to ask is, who can help me do that? So it's instead of the how, it's the who. And I think because we get stuck, we think we can just do it all ourselves. And obviously there's a money challenge there as you're growing. But if and when the time is right, the sooner you can get that help and get those tasks that's not your genius, like off your plate, it sort of frees up this mental bandwidth, like for you to think bigger things and like think about how else to grow the show. So I'm wondering, when did you start to see an inflection point? Because the show started picking up listeners and getting more fans. And I know it was a slow go in the beginning because you were just like, how do we get more listeners? How do we get more listeners?
But then I think you even told me, you're like, this is the fastest growth we've ever seen. We had like 7,000 listeners per show kind of right away.
Yeah, it picked up nicely.
Every week just stepped up massively. And I think one is I was smart in how I shared my podcast. Like one podcast really new in this space I was at. So people were like, whoa, you could be like Shelby and have a podcast. Like I was a little bit new. That was helpful. 2, I had pretty good connections in the outdoor and action sports industry. And one of my strengths was I could pitch sponsors, and I could still pitch sponsors. And I just did custom deals with different brands I really liked and had a relationship with. And then I cold pitched a lot of people, and they said yes, because there was nothing else like that in the space. And so I had brands share the podcast, and I had guests share the podcast, and my mom shared it in a newsletter. I had no idea my mom had like 5,000 people on her newsletter list.
Nice.
Yeah, it's like 74-year-old mom crushing it. I was really anti-social media before starting a podcast. I didn't like it. I thought it was stupid. I didn't want to be on it. And I had to learn to embrace it. So I hired someone to help me manage social media. I ended up taking that back over myself because it's hard to find someone else who has your voice in social media. So that's one thing like I have kind of hung on to. I'm sure I could have better social media if I hired someone, but that's just one part that I've hung on to. But yeah, everything with podcasting, just, I love it. So if there was a lot of things I didn't know, I think you helped me with. There was a lot of things I had to learn along the way. I think the equipment part was really daunting. Like now you can kind of walk into Best Buy and there's a podcast section. I had to go get my phone fixed the other day, and I was like, what? You have a podcast section? Like before we were going to music stores and sourcing things on Amazon, and nobody knew how to figure out podcast equipment. So now there's things like Squadcast. Like it's so easy to do it now, which is great, but it's still hard. You still have to do it.
When did you catch REI's attention, and talk a little bit how that happened? Yeah.
So at the very beginning, I had an outdoor based adventure show, and I knew I wanted to gather sponsors right away that fit that show. And REI was at the top of my list. And someone had told me, I ran into this guy at the grocery store who was the VP at an outdoor brand. He's like, Shelby, I just had dinner with the president of REI. You need to pitch them. They're doing this campaign called Force of Nature, targeting women in the outdoors. And I was like, I'm a woman. I'm like doing this podcast about the outdoors.
Check.
They're gonna love it. He's like, they're gonna totally fund your show. So I found a contact at REI and was like, gave him my pitch and kind of expected him to be like, yeah. And he's like, you seem really enthusiastic, Shelby, but no, we're not doing anything with podcasts. And I was like, okay, cool. Well, kind of like puppy between my legs, walked off. Yeah. And then I was like, okay, well, they said, no, I'm going to go pitch other sponsors. I had to like move quickly.
Of course, yeah.
I let it go. And then 6 months later, I hired a guy to help me make the most badass pitch deck ever. So I actually made it. And then he just like aligned it so the pictures were like straight. Not very good with Photoshop and PowerPoint. So he helped me make this badass PowerPoint, and I pitched all these brands, and I was like, oh my God, REI. So I texted REI and I was like, hey, or I emailed them and I said, hey, I'm getting ready for season 2 and finding sponsors. Do you guys think you want to be involved? Can I send you a pitch deck? And the guy wrote back right away. He'd been so hard to get a hold of. Like he'd literally email me like every 3 weeks, every 4 weeks. Emailed within like a couple minutes, said, hey, Shelby, actually, we're really interested in the podcast space. Would you like to jump on a call today? And we jumped on a call, and REI was just playing with the podcast space, and we ended up doing a licensing agreement for the next 2 years. They licensed the show. I still owned it. And then last year they were like, hey, we want to buy your show. And I was like, wait, really? Like, and I went back to my business plan, and at the top of my list, it said sell show to REI in 3 years.
Wow.
And
that's
I was
so
like,
awesome.
But I didn't want to sell it, Perry. I was like, this is my baby. I've spent the last 2 years like building it.
It's your identity, like, especially when you grow something from like, seed.
Yeah.
And just watch it flourish. You have a real connection to it.
I have to be honest, like it's been the best thing I've done, like selling my podcast. One, because it freed up some income so that I could like focus on what I wanted to do other than just podcasting.
Yeah.
It's stressful getting sponsors every week. And also, they've brought me guests that I never would have met. Which is so cool. Like this year, the show is so this year they're picking all the guests.
Okay.
And years past, I picked all the guests, and they're bringing me people that I think are so cool that I never would have met, that I never heard about. And it's just fun. It's a new experience. And I have a team. I really like working with a team.
How fun is that?
Yeah, it's great. I ended up starting a new podcast because I'm like, I'm going to want to start another baby.
Yeah.
And I've been really interested in health and wellness.
Okay.
And so I started a podcast called Vitamin Joy right in the middle of the pandemic because I was like, God, people need like health and bite-sized information, but they also need humor. Like we've lost our collective sense of humor as a country and as humanity. I mean, I just feel like laughter is really important medicine along with nutrition, sleep, everything else. So that's what I'm exploring in this new show. And it's been fun to start a new show from the ground up.
Did you notice on Wild Ideas Worth Living, did your skills as a podcast host improve? Did you notice things you were doing differently over the course of the years?
Yeah, I think prepping is like very important. People underestimate prepping and research. There's like the Larry King way. Larry said that he never researched guests because...
Rest in peace.
Yeah, I know. So sweet. It's sad that he died. Man, it sucks. But he was such a great journalist. And his approach was like, hey, I'm gonna present guests to people who've never heard about them either.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to know too much about them either. I want to know what the average person knows about them. I like to go a different route. I like to research the heck out of my guests because a lot of them aren't professional speakers or authors. Like, let's be honest, the best podcast guests, they're authors or professional speakers because they're either trying to sell their book and they've spent so much time researching something, they have a lot to say about it, or they've been paid to speak. Athletes aren't always the best podcast guests. So sometimes I've had to train them and that's okay. Or find... I like to start interviews with where someone is really excited to talk about. And usually that's something, and if they are a professional speaker or podcaster or author, I start with something that nobody asks them usually. And that's usually pretty fun.
Yeah, describe it sometimes as active listening. Like there's a conversation happening and as a host, you have to remember there's 3 people always in the room. There's the host, there's the guest, and the listener. And if you forget that someone is listening to the conversation you and I are having now, terminology, terms, keeping it engaging, it's something that's you always have to be doing consistently, and always be curious as well. I think be curious about your guest and how they got to where they got to, and sort of bring your listener along the journey. What tips have you been given to people? Because I'm sure you get asked a lot now, like, hey, Shelby, how do I conduct a really good interview?
I mean, I finally started like a podcast course because Johnny was like, Shelby, you cannot go to coffee with someone for free again and help them with their podcast, because it was becoming like once, I'm sure you get it, like it was every day. Yeah. So I started this like podcast class called No BS Podcasting to just get people started and growing without like the theory. Just go. I don't know. I took so many podcast class and a lot of them aren't successful podcasters. So I'm like, it's so stupid. Yeah. You can hit friend of Shelby for 50% off if you've listened to this podcast, by the way. Friend of Shelby. Just go to shelbystanger.com/courses. So
yeah, we'll put them in the show notes as well.
Your nice plug, huh? So advice and tips just on interviewing or everything?
Yeah, interviewing, yeah. Because you do a really good job of it. You've had a lot of experience. You started out in journalism. So I think there's a lot of, what you've learned, what to do, what not to do to engage with your guest.
I think you should talk to people about what they want to talk about. That's helpful. If they don't want to talk about it, it's a podcast is a mutual agreement. You know, two people are in the conversation, and I think you just have to be aware of that. They're giving you your time, so you have to be really respectful of that and find out what they're excited about. I like to ask my guests stories because I think stories illustrate points a lot. And if I can, I'm really lucky. I edit my podcast, so if we mess up, we can go back and cut stuff. And I tell guests that in the beginning, and that relaxes them so much. And I think that's kind of an advantage of not having a live podcast. Although there's advantages and disadvantages of both. And then I just try to keep it fun. Like, if I could, I would take, my dream would be we would go surfing with all my guests and then we would podcast. And I've been able to do that with probably a dozen of my guests.
I think I remember an early one because you had the Zoom recorder and you did it in a van or something like that.
I did one in a van. Yeah, I went camping and I lived in someone's like van, and they had a van rental company. They let us stay in it for a night, and we interviewed them in a van.
Yeah, I remember that.
I've done podcasts at the beach, which is great. The Zoom
is so fun. I love the ambient sound stuff. Like when you can bring in like what's happening outside, people feel like they're there with you because they hear the sounds and birds chirping. And sometimes, like, because this is a podcast where I interview podcasters, if there's a mistake, a dog barking, like I leave it in because I'm just like, look, that's what podcasters have to deal with on a day-to-day basis.
Oh my God. Last night I interviewed this guy who is the most beautiful man, and he's been through so much. He lost his wife in an avalanche while they were skiing together. And as he was telling me this story, and starts crying, by the way, this amazing mountain man is like crying on the podcast. We're on Squadcast. My freaking fire alarm starts.
Oh my God. Wow.
And I was like, I didn't even know we had a fire. Of course, we have a smoke detector fire alarm in the house. All houses do, but I'd never heard mine.
Yeah.
And I guess like the battery just decided to die last night at that time. And it was so funny that we both just started laughing, which was kind of nice because like he'd been crying and then we started laughing. But yeah, I think I'll ask my editors to leave it in. I'm like, honey, can you please go see what that is? So Johnny had to like my husband tried to take the fire extinguisher or the fire alarm off, and he threw it underneath like a mattress so that because we couldn't figure out how to turn it off.
Yeah, because the battery, if the battery's out, it beeps. It's just it's supposed to do that.
Unplug it. So it was crazy. Anyways.
Have you released that episode yet?
No, we literally did the interview yesterday. I'll let you know if we can find it.
What you can do is take that part and start the interview with that. So it's kind of, or just do it as an outtake at the end. People do like outtakes at the end, which is fun.
I would like that. Yeah. We do outtakes at the end of the year with Wild Ideas Worth Living and Vitamin Joy. They collected like all the times I messed up and saved them in a file. And just,
how fun is it to be working with a production team?
It's so nice. I mean, it is so nice. I can't even tell you. And I have a producer now for Vitamin Joy too. That's great. Very
cool.
There's a podcast school out of Maine that like really grooms great editors.
Oh, what is it?
I don't know what it's called, but it's like some audio school out of Maine.
Oh, well, my friend has one as well, but I don't think it's from Maine. Podcast Engineering School, Chris Curran.
It's like, it's an audio school. It's like literally like accreditation, and I don't know, if you can hire someone who's also a journalist, like for me, the writing is really, remember I was always like kind of anal on the writing. Yeah. For me, hiring a journalist that helps with writing is helpful because I'm a bit picky. I also learned that show notes really don't matter as much as you think they do.
Yeah, it depends. I think for people,
totally
it depends what type of show it is. If it's more business related, for some clients, we actually take the transcription and turn it into like almost like a white paper PDF format.
Oh, that's awesome.
For an older demographic, like coming from corporate, they're used to like these like formal like transcription, like they can read. And so like, I find sometimes with like demographics like in their 50s and 60s, they actually like reading and reading the content. So,
but I was like, I look at Joe Rogan, like he doesn't have show notes. Mark Barron doesn't have show notes. It just depends what you're going for. And if you do show notes, be strategic about them. Like, use them for what you need to use them for. Like maybe they're extra content for your blog. Maybe if you have an adventure podcast, use the content and syndicate it to other adventure magazines, and then they could use it as an article.
Can you talk a little bit about coming back to the sponsorship? Because I know that's something you did a really good job at. So for people that are getting started, I coached them on making sure, first of all, the podcast is something that would be of interest to sponsors. That's like number one. And so like I think people try to have general podcasts and they're wondering like after like 3 months and they've got 40 downloads per episode, like, where are the sponsors? And I'm just like, a sponsor's not interested in your show. I'm sorry to tell you. So I'd love for you to just kind of talk about a little bit.
Well, I think you kind of hit it on the head. Like, the first thing is you make sure your podcast is niche and services. It's not about you. It's about your sponsor. Like, how can your show help your sponsor?
Yeah.
It's not how your sponsor can help you, even though they will help you. You want to help them.
Yeah.
And that's like the number one first step. How can you help them? So I have a new podcast about health. And I actually got approached by a magazine that I really love that was like, hey, we have this product that's really cool. We want to pay you to do some travel segments in it. And I was like, yeah, that kind of like works with Vitamin Joy. What's the company? They told me the name of the company. I'd never heard of it. Googled it. And I was like, okay, it's either like vehicle company or maybe it's something else. And then it's like a nicotine company at the end of the day. And I was like, you guys, I can't.
Wow.
It was a lot of money. Like, I could have paid for everything for the year.
Yeah.
But I have a health podcast. So like, I can't be sponsored by a nicotine company.
Yeah.
Even though I would have been sponsored by a magazine and doing a partnership with a nicotine company, I like inherently had to say no. So first you have to decide, what sponsors are you willing to have on your podcast? And what do you want to promote? Some people are cool, with anything, Viagra ads, nicotine, alcohol. I'm not. But if you're okay promoting anything, great. For my health show, I've just kind of identified, like, what do I eat? What do I drink? What do I wear? What do I like? What brings me joy? And what company can I help reach a demographic that I also reach? So for REI, I knew they wanted to reach more women in the outdoors. And I had this like giant Rolodex of people I'd already interviewed, relationships from the outdoor industry, tons of friends, tons of contacts, tons of like direct listeners already. And I had been a reporter in the action sports industry. So the CEOs of all the major companies read my stuff and were on my email newsletter list. So that was beneficial to a lot of people initially. You gave me really good advice. You said, hey, when you're pitching sponsors, especially sponsors who at the time didn't know about podcasting, give them a sample ad read.
Yeah.
So I would record sample ad reads and send them to sponsors with my pitch. Now, I think it's important to have some sort of media kit, whether it's a page on your website or just a website, like an Instagram, like something that shows that you're a professional, serious about podcasting, and then create some sort of pricing for them. When you're brand new and starting out. So that van company that I told you about, they're like, hey, Shelby, we bought a package of sponsors on this podcast show. I was like, really? What'd you pay? And they're like, we paid $100 for 10 ads. And I was like, that's awesome. So there was a company that started out and they're going after van lifers. So they reached out to van companies and they're just charging them something that's so easy so that they can have sponsors, $10 an ad.
Kudos to the podcast. It's just saying, hey, look, we'd rather get something than nothing. It gets us into the practice of like doing an ad read. I tell business clients when we launch, start with a sponsor, and the sponsor is you and your business. Like, this ad is brought to you by my company, by my coaching course, by my training program. Just so you, as a host, because like you have to be comfortable doing an ad read, like saying the words and doing it week over week.
And then if you have a small amount of listeners on your show and you're going after big companies that only pay you based on a CPM, which is the cost per thousand, mil is 1,000 listeners, you're not going to make a lot of money if you have under 10,000 listeners a show. So it's better to create, if you need to make money off of sponsorship, first of all, the best thing to do is to have your own thing that you're selling, your own product, like a podcast course. Or if I was smart, I'd have like a health course that I sold through Vitamin Joy. I don't right now because I'm doing some other things, but that's what a lot of people do.
Lots of irons in the fire.
Yeah, but if that's what I wanted to do to make money, that's what I would do. So there's a lot of ways to do it. The first is have your own product. The second is make it so that it's mutually beneficial for the other party. So if your podcast doesn't have a lot of listeners, maybe your Instagram has a big reach. So maybe you also do social posts. Maybe you give them content. Maybe you give them access to one of your guests. Maybe you do a live Instagram with them. There's other things you can do to be a good partner to your sponsor, but over deliver to your sponsors because they pay you. And also know that a sponsor can cut you at any time. So like if you're reliant on sponsorships, that's on you.
Yeah.
Like their businesses, they've got their own agendas and it's, they love you, they might love you, but like if a pandemic happens, they have to switch their budgets to other avenues and a podcast might not be one of the avenues they're supporting at that point. Same time, podcasts are really hot right now. So
Yeah, it's this idea of, I call it the platform approach as opposed to the download approach, where you're saying, because the download numbers are not going to be impressive. You're not going to be wowing people with your download numbers early on. But if you say, to your point, I've got tens of thousands of Instagram followers or huge Twitter following, like paint all those numbers together, pull them all together. And most people, if you start adding all those things, website visitors, email list, like you'll get into thousands, tens of thousands. And that's like, this is my platform. And then what you promise and you over deliver is like, not only are you going to get the ad read, but you'll get the mention on Twitter, you'll get the mention on Instagram, you'll get the mention in my newsletter. And that's what we do. I started a new podcast in the vertical farming industry, like just because I was curious about the topic, and I started interviewing founders and CEOs. And
Cool.
I got a sponsor before I even launched the show. They paid for the whole season, like 13 episodes. And it was just like, oh, it was just an aha moment. Like, it's so niche, like, and they want niche audiences. And then we subsequently got one for season 2 now.
Yeah, exactly that. So like if you can have a niche podcast, let's say you're a mom and you have a podcast about newborns.
Yeah.
You have such an opportunity to go after products that help moms with newborns.
Yeah.
Because that's such a
And
critical time in people's life.
probably could go even more niche than that.
Yeah.
Newborns with specific conditions, or
Yeah.
I think it'd be definitely helpful.
Agree. And everybody has something that they're an expert at talking about. So that's the other thing, is like the imposter syndrome. I think that's something that I teach. I would say I spend a lot of time, like you do, helping people get over imposter syndrome with the podcast. I had a ton of journalism experience, a ton of marketing experience, a ton of experience in action sports. And yet there was a time when I started where I still didn't feel like I was qualified to be a podcaster like Tim Ferriss or Rich Roll. But you know what? Like, I'm just as qualified, if not more than them. I have more journalism experience than both of them. So you have to get over your own imposter syndrome because you're an expert in something.
Have you connected with Rich Roll yet?
No, but I'm buddies with his agent. His agent and I talk every day. He's great.
I feel like that's happening soon, and I'm definitely looking forward to that conversation.
You're sweet. His agent and I are like, he's been really actually helpful to me in podcasting, and his agent also reps Steve-O, who's like really funny. Steve-O is the guy from Jackass. Who has an incredible podcast called
Oh, really?
something with Wild, like Wild Ride.
Okay.
Yeah.
So oh man, this time flies by so much. I feel like, because you know what, no, it's just, I think what's interesting about podcasting, when you have your own show, and I've had this one since 2014, it's a mix now of like an opportunity to catch up with my podcasting friends and people that I haven't seen, like you, like like a dear friend that I miss, and just chatting with. Like, that's what was fun about setting up the show with you. We got to talk more frequently. And so like the mix now for me is like, who do I want to continue relationships with and still talk to and then record a podcast, and then who are some new people in the podcasting space that I want to meet. And I think that's the beauty of podcasting now. It's my extended family, and especially during COVID, it's like my opportunity to like chat with my friends from around the world.
It was so cool reading the New York Times about during the pandemic, and there was an article about podcasting, and they're like interviewing, or they're mentioning you in your podcast. It was
that
so
was
cool.
crazy.
I was pumped.
Yeah, I was at a coaching event with my coach Taki from Black Belt, and it was in the newspaper, and they mentioned Podcast Junkie, and I was like blown away, because I was just like, I was trying to share. I think I grabbed 2 copies of it because I ran down to the lobby because it was like no tell. It's one of those moments when you're like, stargazing or whatever you want to call it. Like, I was like, this is cool moment in podcasting.
Having a coach is really cool. I think that's really cool that you have a coach.
Yeah. Have you worked with one before?
You're like the closest to a coach I've had. Tons of soccer coaches, tons of different types of coaches.
But even that, like all those types of coaches, like they help you get to the next level, to a place that you can get there on your own, but having a coach to just show you the mistakes they've made. And that's when, like, I always tell people who are like a little apprehensive about coaching people, I'm like, you don't need to get them to like the Mecca or the Holy Grail. You just need to get them like one step further than where they are. And then as you grow, you're just going to reach back on the stairs and pull them up to that one step that you were just on. And just, that's all you need to do. Like, you don't need to like be the super coach for them. They just need like help getting you to that one step, and you have the information because you've been there before.
People have been asking me to do coaching for them, and I'm always like, I'm not a coach. I've never taken a coaching course.
They just need to have you hold their hand. I got a couple of questions as we wrap up. What's something you've changed your mind about recently?
What's something I've changed my mind about recently? I'm just trying not to be judgmental of people during this pandemic. Like,
interesting.
I have very different views of, like wearing a mask and like than other people. Like I wear one and some people don't. And well, I guess I haven't changed my view on that. Just everybody's approach to like what they think is safe is really different. And I'm trying to be as safe as I can. Not get it, not spread it. But I think I'm just trying not to be super judgmental on other people because, businesses are affected. People's parents are dying. Like it's a very confusing time. So I'm just trying to change my mind on not being judgmental and just trying to be kind to everybody. I guess that's the biggest thing.
It's interesting because it's almost like what happens at Thanksgiving when you're like extended family, and now you start to see everyone's political views and religious views, and it's just like the three topics you don't talk about at Thanksgiving is like politics, religion, and sex, right?
Or money.
Yeah, or money. And I think
we talk about sex at our dinner table.
You got to invite me to one of your Thanksgivings then.
It's fun.
But it's highlighted like people that you didn't think had differing opinions about something that's so basic, like, just common decency, or just like not losing your shit in public, or just like caring for the other people by not spreading like a virus. But people are taking weird stands on this sort of stuff, and I'm not even on Facebook anymore because it's just got so bananas. I just like don't even engage there as well. It's been interesting to watch.
I'm also even more proactive these days about showcasing people on my shows and hiring people that I think are underrepresented than I was before. So it's not like I've changed my mind on it. I'm just more cognizant of it.
Very
just
cool.
more like trying to do it. Like, which has been really cool. And I've interviewed just people I've never would have met before. So it's been really cool.
Yeah, it's having conversations with people who have lived a different life than you. And then, because normally we tend to gravitate towards people that look like us or have the same background as us and or in the same industry as us, whatever you want to call it, or same hobbies as us. But then when we start to talk to people that like we have no idea like what it was like growing up, where they grew up or how they grew up, and when you talk to them, it really opens your mind, and I think just brings us all closer together as humans and people. And I think kudos to you for doing that, because I think more people should be doing that.
Thanks. Well, I like doing it, so it's fun.
What's the most misunderstood thing about you?
Oh, people think I'm so mellow, like laid back surfer. I'm not. I mean, I am, but I'm also not.
Yeah.
I'm mellow and laid back, but I'm like, I think especially guys that would date me at first would be like, oh, she's like so chill.
Surfer chick, yeah.
No.
Well, Shelby, this hour flew by. It's so nice to see your face.
Oh, so nice to see you. Such an honor.
Yeah. And so what's next for you? Like, what are you working on? What projects are you coming on? I want to send more people your way.
Oh, you're so sweet. Thank you. I'm really into this. So Wild Ideas Worth Living is awesome. And it's kind of on autopilot right now. I'm really interested in this new concept, Vitamin Joy, which is doses of joy and health, every other week. But I'm interviewing really interesting people about how to sleep better, how to give up caffeine, how to be sober, even if you're not an alcoholic, how to have more humor in your life. That's been really fun and different. And I'm interviewing like the guy from Bulletproof Coffee. I've got Steve Kotler coming on. I have some decent guests coming on.
Those are good.
Next year.
Yeah,
I haven't started it. So that's kind of what I'm working on. And then I have some other projects in the work that I can't yet talk about, but like I hope they happen. And then, I'm going to be launching a course on pitching, because so many people are like, how do you pitch? How do you pitch sponsors? I think we just need to teach people how to pitch. And that's something I've had to do as a journalist for freelance since I was 16. So it's something I do feel confident about. And, we all have to pitch ourselves these days. If you live in the United States, where if you're an entrepreneur
it's a good skill.
Have a side hustle. Yeah. You got to pitch your ideas.
Yeah.
And that's it. And just, I've been spending a lot of time with family. Like it's been really the highlight of the pandemic for me is like every morning, my sister and my mom and I FaceTime, and we never did that before.
That's
and
so
it's
nice.
just so fun. So I've missed my friends, but one good thing is I've gotten really close to family, and then just reaching out to friends who are single.
Yeah.
I think that's important.
Yeah.
I have a lot of friends who are single, and I'm not. I'm in a really lucky, fortunate position with family and a guy I love, and I live on the beach, and I have neighbors and little kids running around at all times.
That's nice.
It's awesome, but there's a lot of people lonely.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to be of service to others.
Very cool. Well, that's because you're such a big-hearted person, and that's why I love you, because you're awesome.
Well, I miss you, Harry. It's so good to see
too.
you. I'm going to send more people your way because you are the man. And you're a really good podcast coach.
Thank you so much. Where's the best place for folks to connect with you?
Just go to shelbystanger.com or I'm on Instagram at Shelby Stanger. I'm on other channels, but I'm not really there. So basically Instagram at Shelby Stanger or shelbystanger.com. It's like stranger, but without the extra R. Stanger rhymes with banger.
Thanks again, Shelby. Thanks to Shelby for coming on the show. Always appreciated, and especially when I have the opportunity to connect and spend time with friends whose company and energy I really enjoy. Full show notes available at podcastjunkies.com/252 and show and outro music composed by Cedar and Soil. Don't forget to check out our sponsors, Focusrite, and their awesome line of gear, specifically the Focusrite Scarlett 2i2 Pro. Learn more at podcastjunkies.com/Focusrite. Podcast production and marketing provided by Fullcast. Sign up for a free podcast brainstorm at fullcast.co/chat15. Tune in next week for my conversation with Nital Perek, founder, CEO, and director of programs at Innovate Social. If you've made it this far, you're no doubt looking for this week's retention hashtag. Let's go with Surf with Shelby. You can tag her at Shelby Podcasts and tag me at podcast_junkies. Thanks for all you do to support the show. Talk to you next week.